It started with a quiet decision buried deep inside palace correspondence, a connection so small the public barely noticed it, yet so symbolic that Catherine had reportedly protected it for years. Meghan still had one remaining tie to the Cambridge era, one final thread linking her to the future Queen's world. And now, according to palace insiders, that thread has finally been cut. What changed behind closed doors was not simply protocol, it was personal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports first surfaced through scattered royal briefings and whispers moving between senior correspondents. But what initially sounded like another exaggerated palace rumor quickly began to feel far more serious. Insiders close to Kensington Palace allegedly described a tense internal atmosphere that had been building quietly for months, with senior aides repeatedly revisiting one lingering symbolic connection tied to Meghan's former place within the Cambridge household structure. To the public, the issue may have seemed minor, almost invisible beside the endless headlines surrounding memoirs, interviews, and family feuds. Yet within palace walls it reportedly carried enormous emotional weight. This was not simply about titles or ceremonial gestures anymore. According to several royal commentators, this final remaining link represented the last surviving trace of a relationship that Catherine had once tried desperately to preserve, even while others around her argued the separation should have been total long ago. What makes the story even more explosive is the growing belief that Catherine herself had quietly prevented this removal for years, despite mounting pressure from senior advisors and members of William's inner circle. Various interpretations of palace discussions suggest there were repeated attempts. After the Sussex departure to fully sever all remaining institutional associations connected to Meghan, especially following the fallout surrounding Frogmore Cottage and the escalating tensions that followed public interviews abroad. Yet insiders now claim Catherine resisted those efforts behind closed doors, believing that completely erasing every bridge would only deepen the divide inside an already fractured family. Sources familiar with palace administrative conversations reportedly described her approach as measured, patient, and deeply rooted in the hope that time might eventually calm the bitterness consuming both households. While William allegedly adopted a firmer stance much earlier, Catherine is said to have viewed the situation through a different lens, one centered less on punishment and more on preserving at least the possibility of future reconciliation. That quiet resistance reportedly became one of the last reasons this symbolic connection survived at all. But over recent months, something appears to have shifted dramatically inside Kensington Palace. Royal insiders whisper that a series of developments behind the scenes gradually transformed Catherine's thinking, particularly after fresh tensions allegedly surfaced involving ongoing public narratives surrounding the royal family. Though no official explanation has been given, commentators increasingly believe a specific incident triggered a decisive change in mood among senior royals. Palace staff reportedly began describing the remaining Cambridge-era association as the last open door, a phrase that quickly spread through royal media circles and fueled speculation that internal patience was finally running out. The atmosphere allegedly became even more strained once aides began discussing whether maintaining the connection created confusion about the monarchy's future direction. According to observers familiar with royal protocol, symbolic gestures inside the institution are rarely accidental. Every invitation, every patronage, every lingering association carries meaning far beyond what the public sees. And in this case, insiders claim the continued existence of Meghan's final Cambridge tie had started to become a growing source of discomfort among those focused on protecting William and Catherine's long-term image as the future of the monarchy. The timing of the decision only intensified the drama. Reports suggest Harry himself learned about the change after internal notices had already circulated through palace channels, a detail many commentators viewed as especially revealing. Some insiders interpreted it as evidence that the relationship between the households has deteriorated to such a degree that even symbolic decisions are now handled with emotional distance rather than family sensitivity. Others compared the moment directly to earlier institutional fractures, particularly the removal from Frogmore Cottage. where what appeared publicly as a logistical adjustment reportedly carried far deeper emotional consequences behind closed doors. Royal analysts now argue that this latest development may represent something even more profound, a psychological closing of the final chapter linking Meghan to the old Cambridge world she once briefly occupied. And perhaps most painfully of all, observers believe the decision exposes how much Catherine herself may have changed through years of public pressure, betrayal narratives, and relentless institutional strain. Because according to those watching the monarchy closely, the Princess of Wales, who once quietly protected that final connection, may no longer believe there is anything left worth protecting at all. But the real shock was not that Meghan lost the connection, it was discovering why Catherine protected it for so long in the first place. Long before the interviews, memoirs, and icy public standoffs, there was a brief period when Meghan's presence inside Kensington Palace appeared almost seamless. For a moment, the future looked unified. The Cambridges and the Sussexes stood side by side beneath flashing cameras, smiling as though the monarchy had found its modern future. But beneath that polished surface, insiders now claim Catherine was already noticing fractures others refused to see. In those early days, the atmosphere surrounding the so-called Fab Four felt almost untouchable. Royal commentators described it as the monarchy's great modernization project, a carefully balanced image of tradition and change moving together in perfect harmony. William and Catherine represented stability, discipline, and continuity, while Harry and Meghan brought glamour, unpredictability, and global fascination. To the public, it looked like the royal family had finally discovered a formula capable of carrying the institution into a new era. Crowds adored the chemistry between the couples, media coverage exploded with optimism, and palace aides reportedly worked tirelessly to protect the image of unity forming around them. Yet, according to those who observed relationships closely, the tension did not suddenly appear years later. Some insiders now whisper that Catherine sensed emotional undercurrents long before the public noticed anything was wrong, quietly recognizing small moments of discomfort and instability others dismissed as ordinary growing pains inside a high-pressure institution. Reports suggest the true complexity of the situation emerged only after Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal duties, when internal palace discussions allegedly turned toward what connections should remain and which ones needed to disappear entirely. Among those lingering ties was one subtle ceremonial and social association connected to the old Cambridge household network, a symbolic thread many courtiers reportedly believed should have been removed immediately following Megxit. But according to palace insiders, Catherine resisted those calls. While some advisors allegedly viewed the continued connection as unnecessary or even risky, Catherine is said to have taken a far more cautious position behind closed doors. Sources familiar with palace conversations claim she believed stability mattered more than retaliation, especially during a period when the monarchy was already facing extraordinary public scrutiny. Rather than escalate tensions further, she reportedly hoped preserving at least one remaining bridge might prevent the family divide from becoming irreversible. Royal experts now suggest that decision reflected Catherine's instinctive understanding of duty, not sentimentality. She allegedly recognized that every action involving Harry and Meghan would carry enormous symbolic consequences, both for the institution and for the public watching every fracture unfold in real time. But while Catherine reportedly leaned toward patience, insiders claim William's perspective hardened much earlier. Various interpretations of internal discussions suggest the future king became increasingly concerned that maintaining any lingering association blurred the boundaries between active royal responsibility and public criticism directed at the institution itself. Those concerns reportedly intensified as Harry and Meghan's media presence grew more explosive overseas. Interviews, documentaries, public statements, and eventually memoirs transformed what had once seemed like a temporary family disagreement into something far larger and far more damaging. And with each new controversy, palace staff allegedly found themselves revisiting the question Catherine had managed to delay for years. How long could the monarchy continue preserving symbolic ties while simultaneously enduring repeated attacks from outside the institution? Yet despite mounting pressure, insiders say Catherine still hesitated. Some staff members reportedly interpreted her restraint not as affection for Meghan, but as a deeply ingrained commitment to preserving order wherever possible. To Catherine, according to commentators, familiar with royal dynamics, removing the final connection may have felt less like solving a problem and more like acknowledging that the family rupture had become permanent. At the same time, Meghan's transition into Hollywood life reportedly complicated the situation even further inside palace circles. What once seemed like a temporary departure slowly evolved into a completely separate identity built far beyond royal walls. Sources claim this transformation made the remaining Cambridge era connection increasingly controversial among senior aides, especially as the Sussex brand expanded commercially and publicly. To some within the institution, the symbolic link no longer represented reconciliation, it represented confusion. Observers began questioning whether the monarchy could realistically preserve fragments of old associations, while the distance between both households continued growing wider with every passing year. And according to several royal analysts, that is growing. Discomfort eventually placed Catherine in an impossible position, caught between her instinct to protect long-term stability and the harsh realization that the unity she once tried to preserve might already be beyond repair. Yet what began as an act of quiet diplomacy would eventually become the very thing palace insiders say Catherine came to regret most. According to whispers now circulating through royal media circles, the final rupture did not happen during a public interview or a televised accusation. It happened privately through a series of conversations and reports that allegedly reached William and Catherine at exactly the wrong moment. And once those details surfaced, insiders claim the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace shifted almost overnight. What makes the situation so unsettling is that almost nobody outside palace walls seems to know precisely what triggered the sudden change. Royal correspondents have hinted at confidential discussions, tense internal briefings, growing unease among senior aides, but the institution itself has remained almost completely silent. And in royal history, silence often speaks louder than any official statement ever could. According to sources familiar with palace dynamics, tensions between the households had already been simmering quietly beneath the surface for months, even as public attention drifted toward other controversies surrounding the monarchy. Yet something about this latest development reportedly felt different. Staff insiders now claim there was a noticeable shift in tone inside Kensington Palace, as though lingering uncertainty had finally hardened into resolve. Conversations that once centered around patience, diplomacy, and maintaining symbolic bridges allegedly transformed into discussions about boundaries, consequences, and institutional protection. Reports suggest the catalyst may have involved a recent behind-the-scenes incident tied to ongoing media narratives surrounding the royal family. Though details remain heavily guarded, commentators increasingly believe new claims or private concerns reached William and Catherine at a moment when tensions were already dangerously fragile. Some insiders describe a growing belief among senior royals that maintaining even partial associations with Meghan had become increasingly unsustainable, while criticism against the institution continued unfolding publicly. What once appeared manageable reportedly began to feel like an open vulnerability. Inside the future king's household, palace aides allegedly warned that symbolic ties carry enormous meaning within royal structures, particularly during periods of instability. And allowing one final connection to remain untouched was starting to create confusion both internally and externally. To the public, it may have looked insignificant. But within palace walls, according to observers close to royal protocol, the issue had evolved into something far larger than ceremony. It had become a question of where loyalty ended and institutional responsibility began. For Catherine, insiders claim the emotional weight of the decision became even heavier after recent developments allegedly forced her to reevaluate everything she had spent years trying to preserve. Royal experts suggest she had long believed that maintaining one remaining bridge served a greater purpose. Not because the past could be restored, but because total separation carried its own dangers. Yet reports now indicate that perspective slowly began to change. Sources close to palace administrative circles whisper that Catherine started viewing the issue through a far colder lens once. It became clear the public conflict surrounding the Sussexes was not fading with time, but instead becoming more deeply entrenched. The woman once described by aides as the monarchy's quiet stabilizer reportedly found herself confronting a painful realization. Preserving symbolic connections was no longer calming tensions, it was prolonging them. And as that realization spread through Kensington Palace, the atmosphere allegedly became increasingly tense. Staff members reportedly began speaking about enforcing boundaries, a phrase that soon appeared repeatedly across royal commentary and insider analysis. William, according to multiple interpretations of palace discussions, reportedly took an even firmer position behind closed doors. Insiders suggest the future king argued that the monarchy could not continue, maintaining partial associations while enduring repeated criticism from outside the institution. To him, the issue was no longer emotional, it was structural. Some commentators even compared the internal conversations to decisions made during Queen Elizabeth II's reign, moments when the institution chose stability over sentiment, regardless of personal cost. Palace staff allegedly began treating the remaining connection not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as a growing liability capable of undermining the clear separation the monarchy had spent years trying to establish. Yet perhaps the most revealing detail of all was the palace's refusal to publicly address any of it. Instead of calming speculation, the silence only deepened it. Every unanswered question fueled new theories. Every refusal to comment intensified suspicion that something serious had shifted behind closed doors. And according to insiders, that growing pressure eventually pushed the institution toward a conclusion it had once desperately tried to avoid. And as pressure mounted behind palace walls, the decision that once seemed unthinkable suddenly became inevitable. Those who study Catherine closely often describe her as cautious, disciplined, and remarkably patient under pressure. That patience, insiders say, may have been the only reason Meghan's final Cambridge-era connection survived as long as it did. But sometime over the past year, observers noticed something subtle changing in the Princess of Wales: a colder distance, a firmer tone, and far less willingness to leave unresolved tensions lingering in the background. For years, Catherine had carefully cultivated an image built around calm restraint. Even during some of the monarchy's most painful public crises, she rarely appeared reactive, emotional, or openly confrontational. Palace insiders often described her greatest strength as endurance. While others within royal circles allegedly pushed for faster, harsher responses to the Sussex fallout, Catherine reportedly continued searching for ways to preserve stability inside a family already strained by betrayal, illness, and relentless public scrutiny. But according to commentators familiar with palace dynamics, the emotional burden of maintaining that balance slowly began to change her. The woman once viewed as the monarchy's quiet peacemaker increasingly appeared focused on something else entirely: protecting the institution from further fracture before William eventually inherits the throne. Royal insiders now claim Catherine's priorities shifted dramatically over the past year, especially as conversations surrounding the monarchy became more uncertain and emotionally charged. With King Charles facing ongoing health concerns and public pressure mounting around the future of the crown, reports suggest Catherine became far more conscious of the responsibilities waiting ahead of her. Sources close to palace circles whisper that the Princess of Wales gradually moved away from reconciliation-driven thinking and toward a far stricter institutional mindset, one centered not on repairing damaged relationships, but on safeguarding the long-term stability of William's future reign. To some observers, the change felt subtle at first. Small adjustments in tone, less visible openness, greater emotional distance whenever the Sussex situation resurfaced publicly. But behind palace walls, insiders allegedly recognized something much more significant unfolding. Catherine was no longer simply enduring the crisis surrounding Harry and Meghan. According to analysts, she was beginning to manage it like a future queen. What makes the transformation especially striking is how carefully Catherine reportedly concealed it from public view. Palace observers frequently note that she almost never responds emotionally during disputes involving the royal family. No matter how personal the attacks may appear, that restraint, according to royal experts, has become one of the defining features of her public identity. Yet insiders claim the silence often hides enormous internal pressure. Over time, commentators began comparing Catherine more openly to Princess Anne, another royal figure admired for uncompromising loyalty to duty above personal feeling. Both women, according to those close to the institution, understand something fundamental about monarchy that outsiders often miss. Survival sometimes requires emotional sacrifice. And as the Sussex tensions deepened, year after year, reports suggest Catherine increasingly embraced that philosophy. The lingering Cambridge-era connection that she once quietly defended allegedly stopped representing hope for reconciliation, and instead started symbolizing unfinished instability inside the institution she was preparing to help lead. According to staff insiders, the eventual removal carried far greater emotional significance than the public fully understood. Administratively, it may have appeared minor. Symbolically, however, it represented the end of Catherine's final attempt to preserve even a fragment of the old relationship between the households. Sources familiar with palace discussions claim the decision was difficult precisely because Catherine herself had spent years protecting the connection from earlier attempts to remove it. That history reportedly gave the final separation an almost haunting quality inside royal circles, as though the Princess of Wales was quietly acknowledging that the path back had finally disappeared. Some commentators even describe the moment as the emotional conclusion of the entire Fab Four era, not because of one explosive argument, but because the last surviving gesture of patience had finally been withdrawn. And perhaps that is why the shift inside Kensington Palace now feels so consequential to those watching closely. Royal analysts increasingly believe this moment reflects something larger than a single family dispute. It reflects a monarchy entering a colder, stricter, and more disciplined era under William and Catherine, where emotional ambiguity is viewed as dangerous rather than compassionate. But while Catherine's decision may have closed one chapter, it also exposed how deeply fractured the royal family had quietly become behind the scenes. For Prince Harry, insiders suggest the news carried a different kind of sting. Titles can be removed. Residences can be reclaimed. Security can disappear. But symbolic connections are different. They represent belonging. And according to several royal commentators, this final Cambridge separation may have confirmed Harry's deepest fear that the emotional bridge back to his old life is now almost completely gone. What makes the moment so emotionally charged is that, beneath years of public conflict and carefully managed appearances, many observers still believed Harry quietly held on to the idea that reconciliation with William and Catherine might someday remain possible. Even after the interviews, the memoirs, and the endless cycle of accusations and counter-narratives, there was still one lingering assumption within royal circles. Catherine, unlike others around the future king, had never fully abandoned hope that some form of peace could eventually emerge. That belief reportedly mattered deeply to Harry. According to royal analysts, he viewed Catherine not simply as his brother's wife, but as one of the last emotional links to the life he lost when the Sussex departure transformed from temporary rebellion into permanent exile. And because of that history, insiders claim the quiet removal of Meghan's final Cambridge-era connection carried an emotional force far greater than the palace may have anticipated. Reports now suggest Harry was deeply frustrated by how abruptly the decision unfolded. Sources familiar with the atmosphere surrounding the Sussex household claim there was particular anger over the belief that internal notices had already circulated before meaningful communication reached him directly. To some commentators, that detail revealed something painfully symbolic about the current state of the royal family. The emotional closeness that once defined William and Harry's relationship appears, according to palace insiders, colder than ever before. Once inseparable brothers who navigated tragedy, public scrutiny, and royal pressure side by side, they are now increasingly described as figures living inside completely different realities. Insiders whisper that direct trust between them has deteriorated so severely that even relatively small institutional decisions now carry the weight of larger betrayals. And within that growing distance, Catherine's role reportedly became more emotionally significant than ever. Royal experts suggest Harry once believed she remained one of the few senior royals capable of softening William's harder instincts toward the Sussex situation. That belief, according to several commentators, may now have collapsed entirely. For Meghan, sources claim the removal was interpreted very differently. Reports suggest she viewed the decision not as an isolated adjustment, but as another calculated rejection from an institution she has long believed was determined to push her permanently outside royal life. Some observers compared the emotional impact directly to the Frogmore Cottage fallout, when the loss of the couple's UK residence reportedly symbolized far more than property alone. In both cases, commentators argue the deeper issue was belonging. Frogmore represented a physical connection to Britain and royal life. This final Cambridge-era tie represented something even more personal: acknowledgement. And once that acknowledgement disappeared, insiders say it became increasingly difficult for the Sussexes to believe any meaningful reintegration into the family structure still remained possible. Over time, the public trust between the couples has reportedly eroded to such an extent that even neutral gestures are now interpreted through the lens of suspicion, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. What once might have been resolved privately years ago has instead evolved into a prolonged institutional fracture, watched by millions around the world. Yet despite the bitterness surrounding the situation, some insiders still believe King Charles quietly hopes tensions can eventually cool, even if full reconciliation now feels increasingly distant. Sources close to royal observers claim the king remains emotionally troubled by the ongoing divide between his sons, particularly during a period already overshadowed by personal health struggles and uncertainty surrounding the monarchy's future. But others inside palace circles are far less optimistic. Royal commentators increasingly question whether the emotional damage between William, Harry, Catherine, and Meghan has now become too deep to fully repair. The silence between the households reportedly grows heavier with each passing year, while every symbolic separation only reinforces the perception that the divide is no longer temporary but structural. And perhaps that is why this latest decision feels so significant to those watching closely. It was never simply about one remaining connection. It was about the painful realization that the family unity once presented to the world may now exist only as a memory. And yet the most revealing part of this story was not the removal itself. What it revealed about the monarchy Catherine and William are preparing to inherit. Inside the modern monarchy, symbols matter almost as much as crowns. A patronage, a residence, a title, even a lingering association, each one signals trust, legitimacy, and proximity to the institution itself. And when one of those links quietly disappears, palace insiders understand the message immediately. The line has been redrawn. The future has been chosen. And someone has been left outside it. For many royal observers, that is why the disappearance of Meghan's final Cambridge-era connection feels far larger than the palace will ever publicly admit. On paper, it may seem administrative, a small adjustment buried beneath layers of royal protocol and institutional housekeeping. But inside the House of Windsor, insiders claim nothing symbolic is ever truly small. Every gesture carries meaning. Every removal carries intent. And according to commentators who closely follow the monarchy's internal evolution, this decision reflects something much deeper than lingering family tension. It reveals the shape of the institution William and Catherine are quietly preparing to inherit, a monarchy that appears increasingly focused on discipline, clarity, and absolute control over the boundaries surrounding the crown. Reports suggest the decision forms part of a broader long-term strategy being shaped behind palace walls as William gradually prepares for the immense responsibilities waiting ahead. Royal experts increasingly describe the future monarchy as leaner, stricter, and far less willing to tolerate ambiguity than previous generations. The emotional flexibility that once allowed unresolved relationships to quietly exist in the background reportedly no longer fits the direction William and Catherine believed the institution must take in order to survive. Sources familiar with palace thinking claim Catherine viewed the final removal not as retaliation, but as necessary clarity moving forward. To her, according to insiders, preserving symbolic connections while public conflict continued only prolonged uncertainty inside an already fragile institution. And as pressure surrounding the monarchy intensified through health crises, public scrutiny, and growing questions about the future of the crown, the need for unmistakable boundaries allegedly became impossible to ignore. What once seemed compassionate reportedly started to feel dangerously unsustainable. Palace insiders now whisper that the era of what some courtiers privately called informal flexibility is quietly ending. In previous decades, the monarchy often relied on ambiguity to manage family tensions behind closed doors, preserving appearances even when relationships privately deteriorated. But commentators believe William intends to operate differently when his time eventually comes. According to royal analysts, the future king reportedly views unresolved institutional gray areas as long-term risks, capable of weakening public confidence in the crown itself. That perspective, insiders claim, explains why symbolic gestures now carry such enormous significance inside Kensington Palace. Meghan's remaining Cambridge-era tie was never simply about nostalgia or courtesy. Over time, it allegedly became a visible contradiction inside an institution trying desperately to define who remains fully inside its future structure and who no longer does. And once the monarchy began prioritizing institutional certainty above emotional hesitation, the existence of that lingering connection reportedly became harder and harder to justify. What makes the story especially haunting is how clearly it reflects the deeper tensions shaping the modern royal family. Loyalty, duty, public criticism, personal pain, all of it now appears tightly woven into every decision unfolding behind palace walls. Meghan's final connection to the Cambridge world disappearing is being portrayed by many observers as the symbolic conclusion of a long and painful unraveling that began years ago, but never truly stopped accelerating. The cheerful unity once presented during the height of the Fab Four era now feels almost impossible to reconcile with the cold institutional reality taking shape today. Public trust between the households has reportedly eroded so deeply that even silence itself has become politically charged. Every gesture is analyzed. Every absence becomes meaningful. And according to some insiders, that constant pressure has fundamentally changed how William and Catherine now approach the future. Stability, not sentiment, appears to have become the guiding principle. Perhaps that is the most revealing part of this entire saga. Not the removal itself, but the philosophy behind it. Observers increasingly believe the future monarchy under William and Catherine will prioritize structure over emotional compromise, institutional protection over personal reconciliation, and certainty over ambiguity. To supporters, that approach represents strength during an unstable era. To critics, it reflects a colder and more distant vision of royal life. But regardless of perspective, palace insiders seem to agree on one thing. This moment marks the end of something that once felt recoverable. Because in the House of Windsor, insiders whisper that doors rarely slam shut all at once. They close slowly, silently, and finally without ever reopening again. The moment rumors of the removal began circulating online, royal watchers erupted into competing camps almost instantly. Some saw Catherine's decision as long overdue. Others viewed it as the clearest sign yet that reconciliation inside the royal family may already be dead. But according to media insiders, the palace's greatest concern was never public outrage. It was the dangerous possibility that the story might expose just how divided the monarchy has quietly become behind closed doors. Within hours of the first insider reports surfacing, social media platforms became flooded with arguments, speculation, emotional reactions, and relentless analysis from royal commentators around the world. What might once have remained a quiet palace adjustment suddenly exploded into a deeply personal global debate. Supporters of Catherine framed the move as an inevitable consequence of years of public conflict, insisting the Princess of Wales had shown extraordinary patience while enduring constant institutional strain. 2. The final removal was not cruel. It was necessary. They argued Catherine had spent years protecting symbolic ties long after many inside the monarchy reportedly believed those ties should have disappeared entirely. And now, according to that perspective, the future queen had simply reached the limit of what duty could reasonably demand from her. But the backlash emerged just as quickly. Critics accused the monarchy of becoming increasingly cold, rigid, and emotionally unforgiving, particularly toward Harry and Meghan. Some commentators warned that every new symbolic separation only deepened the perception that the institution had abandoned any meaningful attempt at reconciliation. Others argued the decision reinforced the Sussex narrative that emotional distance inside the royal family had hardened into permanent exclusion. The debate became especially explosive because the issue did not feel ceremonial or procedural. It felt personal, deeply personal, and that emotional undertone transformed the story into something far larger than a routine royal adjustment. According to analysts, the public was not reacting simply to the removal itself, but to what it appeared to reveal about the current emotional state of the monarchy. Behind every argument online lingered a darker question few could ignore anymore. Had the relationship between William, Catherine, Harry, and Meghan now deteriorated beyond repair? Inside palace walls, insiders claimed the growing media frenzy triggered serious concern among senior aides. Reports suggest officials feared renewed scrutiny surrounding the Sussex split at precisely the moment the monarchy was already navigating immense institutional pressure. Comparisons to earlier crises surfaced almost immediately. The Oprah interview, the release of Spare, the departure from Frogmore Cottage. Each previous rupture suddenly returned to public conversation, not as isolated controversies but as chapters in one long and painful unraveling that now appeared to be reaching its emotional conclusion. According to royal observers, the palace's anxiety was never truly about criticism from the public. The monarchy has survived criticism for generations. What reportedly worried aides far more was the possibility that this story would expose how much internal trust had quietly collapsed behind closed doors. Because once the public begins viewing royal decisions through the lens of emotional fracture, rather than institutional duty, the carefully controlled image of unity becomes much harder to preserve. Royal commentators soon found themselves divided over the true meaning behind Catherine's decision. Some described it as strategic, a calculated move designed to establish unmistakable boundaries ahead of William's future reign. Others viewed it as emotional exhaustion finally surfacing after years of restraint. And some analysts argued the truth likely existed somewhere painfully in between. The monarchy, according to those interpretations, now appears trapped between two competing realities. The need to project stability to the world while privately managing relationships that may already be beyond saving. That contradiction has become increasingly visible with every passing year, and this latest controversy reportedly magnified it more than ever before. Public fascination continues growing precisely because the story feels less like a royal protocol dispute and more like a family tragedy unfolding in slow motion beneath centuries of tradition and expectation. Every silence feels loaded. Every gesture feels symbolic. Every absence feels intentional. And perhaps that is why this moment continues resonating so powerfully across royal media circles. It is no longer just about Meghan, Catherine, or one final connection disappearing quietly behind palace walls. It is about what happens when an institution built on permanence begins struggling to hold together the people inside it. But beyond headlines, insiders say this story may ultimately be remembered for something much larger than Meghan alone. For years, there remained a lingering belief among royal observers that some invisible bridge still connected the Sussexes to the old Cambridge world. Even after the interviews, the memoirs, the accusations, and the endless headlines, that final symbolic tie seemed to suggest the door was never fully closed. But now, insiders whisper that illusion has finally disappeared, and with it, perhaps the last surviving trace of the royal future the world once imagined for William, Catherine, Harry, and Meghan together. There was a time when the monarchy appeared to stand at the beginning of a completely different story. The image of the so-called Fab Four once carried enormous emotional power, not only for the public but reportedly for the institution itself. William and Catherine represented continuity and discipline. Harry and Meghan brought energy, unpredictability, and global fascination. Together, they seemed to embody a future capable of blending tradition with modern relevance in a way the monarchy had struggled to achieve for decades. For a brief moment, the palace appeared united around that vision. But according to insiders, the harmony the world saw publicly was far more fragile behind closed doors than anyone realized at the time. Small fractures slowly widened into emotional distance, and emotional distance eventually hardened into institutional separation. What makes this final chapter feel so haunting is not simply that another connection has disappeared, but that it appears to confirm something far more painful. The future many once believed inevitable may never have truly survived at all. Royal insiders now describe the removal of Meghan's final Cambridge-era tie as emotionally significant, far beyond its official importance. To the public, it may seem like another quiet adjustment buried inside royal protocol. But within palace circles, commentators say it symbolizes the definitive end of the entire Fab Four era. Not through one explosive confrontation, but through years of accumulated disappointment, mistrust, conflicting loyalties, and emotional exhaustion slowly pulling the households further apart. Sources familiar with the atmosphere surrounding Kensington Palace claim Catherine to be a very sick woman. Understood the emotional weight of the decision more deeply than most people realized. That understanding reportedly made the choice even harder. Because according to several royal observers, Catherine was one of the last figures inside the institution still willing to preserve even symbolic traces of connection after the Sussex departure. Yet, over time, insiders say her priorities changed. The woman who once reportedly hoped unresolved tensions might eventually cool began focusing instead on protecting the stability of the monarchy she and William are preparing to lead. In the end, according to analysts, institutional clarity outweighed personal history. That shift has increasingly shaped how William and Catherine are now viewed both inside and outside royal circles. Commentators frequently describe the future monarchy under their leadership as disciplined, tightly controlled, and deeply conscious of protecting institutional boundaries. Ambiguity, insiders claim, is no longer seen as compassionate. It is seen as dangerous. And within that colder framework, Harry and Meghan now appear positioned permanently outside the royal inner structure that once defined their entire public identity. Royal analysts argue the separation no longer feels merely official or logistical. It feels psychological, emotional, almost irreversible. Every symbolic removal reinforces the sense that the distance between the households is no longer temporary but foundational to how the monarchy now functions. The emotional bridge that once seemed damaged but repairable increasingly appears gone altogether. And perhaps that is why this story resonates so deeply with audiences around the world. Beneath all the headlines, titles, interviews, and palace silence lies something profoundly human. The slow collapse of trust inside one of the most visible families on earth. What remains now, according to those watching closely, is a monarchy still governed by the same forces that have shaped it for generations: duty, loyalty, sacrifice, and survival. The institution moves forward even as personal relationships fracture behind it. Catherine reportedly chose institutional stability over unresolved emotion. William appears increasingly focused on defining clear boundaries for the future reign he will one day inherit. Harry and Meghan continue building a life far beyond palace walls, while the royal family itself quietly adapts to their absence with each passing year. And somewhere beneath all of it lingers the ghost of what once might have been a version of the monarchy that promised unity, modernity, and shared purpose. Before years of pain transformed that vision into something far colder and far more distant. Because in the end, palace history suggests the monarchy rarely breaks apart in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly, connection by connection, until one day the silence says more than the crown ever could. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.